You hear the phrase illusion of choice thrown around a lot, but what does it mean exactly? That's the question that I hope to answer in this video as I talk about map design in video games. And I don't mean to tell you what good or bad map design is, though of course I'll tell you my preferences, because certain map configurations are better suited for certain genres and they accomplish different goals. Like if you want to tell a story, you may have more linear progression. If you have an adventure game or something like an RPG, that gives you the leeway to have your maps be a little bit more open to encourage exploration. And it is the power of the map that makes games more engaging and it gives them their replay value. And that's something that I'll illustrate as we start from a conceptual level and build our way up to more complex level design. So here's a basic level fragment. This is something you might see in a puzzle game, where developers try to ease the player into the experience by giving them a condensed version of what they can expect later down the line. In this first example, you can see you have a starting point, a key, and a door, and the game is trying to teach you that you must pick up that key to open the door. What I argue is that this is such a basic concept that it's really not needed at all. In fact, it's equivalent to not having the key or door interaction at all, because it doesn't really teach the player how to make a meaningful decision with that key. There's no meaningful decision to be made if you must open that specific door and you must head down this linear path. Like, where else am I gonna go? There's no choice there. So what we could do is we can give the player a little bit more freedom of choice here by branching the path and giving them two doors to open. But then the issue arises that if that key can open both doors, if it's not a one-time use, then it's kind of the same as if you were to not have that key and door interaction at all. What's stopping the player from peeking down both routes if they can freely use the key? The key has to be a resource. Using it has to be expendable in order for that decision to be meaningful. You can see in this example, if that key is a one-time use, it can only open one of those doors, and then you have to live with that choice. I call this the route approach. And you tend to see this in more arcade-style games, so something like Panzer Dragoon, which is a rail shooter. It has different routes that you can take depending on how you choose to steer your dragon through the level. You also have this in Outrun, where the route you take corresponds with the difficulty. But this same approach is also seen in some RPGs, though this is a little bit more rare. You don't see it that often because RPG players tend to not appreciate missable content. But just as an example, in Tactics Ogre, dialogue choices dictate the flow of the game. You can have a wildly different scenario with different maps, different enemy encounters, and different unlockable classes, depending on the dialogue options you make at the end of the first chapter. And something similar also occurs in The Witcher 2, where the choice you make at the end of the first act splinters Act 2 into one of two different scenarios. These aren't physically keys, these aren't physically maps, but it's functionally similar to having this key and door approach, because you're given a tool, and you can use that tool to pick a route. And that route has meaning because it's expendable. You can't choose to take every path that you're afforded. And it should be easy to understand the benefit of this system, which is it makes the game more replayable. You're encouraged to give the game another run or two or three to experience all the different routes that it offers. One of the biggest benefits of Onimusha 2 that it has over its predecessor is its scenario system, where gifting NPCs changes their affinity towards you, and that in turn influences the progression of the story. They may help you in areas that you haven't seen them ever help you before. You get different cutscenes, you get different rewards. These are small changes, but they add up over the course of the playthrough to make it wholly distinct from any other attempt that you've made. But if you give the player a key, and that key is a skeleton key, and it opens every door, it's the solution to every obstacle they're presented, then why even have the keys and doors at all? And this leads us to the next type of map design, where you have sequential key and door progression. You have to pick up a specific key to open a specific door, and that leads to another key and another door, and it chains sequentially, but it's all down a linear progression. You cannot break this progression, and you can't choose different routes, and you can't skip over certain sections. It must be completed in the exact same order by every player during every playthrough. This is the one key fits one door approach, and it's frequently used in cinematic games, so stuff like Uncharted or Final Fantasy XVI. Any game that has to tell a story and is bombarding the player with cutscenes, they typically give you confined areas in which you're looking for a key in order to move on to the next section. They're aggressively linear, but this is not necessarily a con. It has to fit the progression of the story. If you break that progression, then you would wind up skipping over the story, and then that wouldn't make sense. You can't really tell a story in a chaotic order. And that is a drawback of having a game that places too much emphasis on story. It winds up interfering with the options that you can afford the player in gameplay. You can't let the player have too much freedom in how he chooses to move through the environments, because then that would allow him to skip over cutscene triggers. So when you move away from the experience, if you were to chart it out in a linear fashion as a map, you would get something that somewhat resembles this. It's not necessarily picking up keys and opening doors, but it is fighting a specific boss in order to finish an area, and you have to fight it in the same order every time. Every player has an identical experience. And even if it doesn't resemble a literal straight line, what developers do is they contort the map into a way that makes it give you the illusion that you have choices. But as we're going to see in this example, if we chart this out, this level is remarkably linear. It's just obfuscated with different color-coded doors and with twists and turns. Just by changing the structure of the map, but still keeping it linear, you can trick the player into believing that it's more complex than it really is. If I start the game with only the ability to open blue doors, and I must pick up a purple power-up in order to leave, I can't grab this purple power-up because I need a purple one to open that door. I instead need to proceed down the one available path in order to pick up that power-up, and as I backtrack through the level, you can see that there are purple doors along the way that I can open in my attempt to finally leave this area. So this is the type of level design that's commonly seen in action games. In Muramasa, it's almost verbatim structured like this, where you need to grab like a red sword to open the red door, a blue sword to open the blue door. You also see this in the Devil May Cry series, where you need to grab a specific key item and then backtrack through a little portion of the level in order to open a door that you skipped earlier. So even though this is technically the illusion of choice, it tends to suit games that are more combat focused, because what happens if you have a game that's too complex in its map design and you get lost, you can easily settle into fatigue from fighting non-stop waves of enemies as you try to find the path forward. This is why most action games tend to keep the exploration on the lighter side. They give you just enough of a taste to make the level seem interesting, and it's not too railroaded, but it's still on the whole overall pretty linear. And with these simple examples out of the way, I can finally talk about the reason why I made this video, which is how maps are designed in exploration platformers, or what most people call Metroidvanias. This is a typical map layout you would find in either a Metroid or in a Castlevania. The rooms are comprised of squares and they all adhere to a grid, and because these games have frequent loading transitions, you know what the boundaries of each room are, because they're all very small. And you can tell at a glance just from looking at the map what you're getting into when you enter a room. But the key benefit of this type of map design is that it's not cluttered. You don't know what is inside each room. It doesn't tell you what kind of enemies you'll fight, it doesn't show you the platforms, it doesn't show you any stage hazards, if there's water, if there's spikes. Because the map is distilled to a very simple grid, it's very easy to tell how to get through an environment. Not on a microscopic room-to-room scale, but as an overall big picture scale. I can look at this and go, I need to get from the save room to the map room, and in about 1 second I know how to get there. Now what I'm starting to see more of in modern indie platformers is this type of map design, where they get rid of the square grid-like structure and they want to instead show you each jagged wall and the different platforms in the room. The problem that I have with this type of map is that it's not easy at a glance to see the big picture. If I want to get from that same save room to the map room, there's a lot more color and a lot more clutter in the environments. It takes a little bit longer to figure out where I'm going. Not only that, it doesn't tell you the boundaries of each room. It doesn't show you where the loading screens are. They may sneak one in that's not obvious when you look at the map. I'm not here to tell you that you're wrong if you prefer this style of map, it's just not my preference. But what I do want to cover is how simply changing the color of the doors on this map is enough to radically shift how you explore this level. And what game devs have done is they've found ways to trick you into thinking that larger maps are more complex. And to prove this, we're going to chart out the progression for this particular map with these colored doors. So if our goal is to leave this area through either the top or the bottom, you'll notice that we need specific keys in order to escape. If we want to escape through the top, we need a yellow key. And because there's no yellow key on this map, naturally we can assume that our only way out is through the bottom. So how do we get to the green key to open the green door? We follow this in a linear fashion, we'll see how we pick up the purple key, and then the green one, and then we can finally head out. This is generally how most players will proceed through this map. This is the intended progression. And without sequence breaking, without acquiring new skills to reach different heights to acquire power-ups sooner than you otherwise would, this is generally how you'll play through this level every single time. So if we consider what's left outside of the intended progression, you'll notice that there's not much left to explore, maybe a couple of rooms for some minor power-ups. So you may be asking, what hypothetical game is this? Are there games that are taking this approach to map design? And believe it or not, this is how the Prime series is designed, Metroid Prime. Because of Retro's intense distaste for sequence breaking, you can't really crack these games wide open and go through any order you like through the areas like you can with the 2D Metroids. Even something that seems minor like getting space jump immediately at the beginning of Metroid Prime, Retro made it much more difficult to accomplish in the remastered version of Prime, so they're aware that players want to sequence break the game, and they're actively taking steps to discourage it. Speaking of Metroid, all you need to do to make this map resemble something more like Super Metroid is recolor the doors. It's that simple, and with that you get the Metroid approach. So immediately, you can tell that you can now leave this area through the top route because the door is not yellow, it's purple, and you can grab a purple key item on this level. And take a look at these parts that I marked with HJ, that's high jump. Typically you would need the high jump power up to get to these, but a savvy player that knows how to wall jump or bomb jump can get to this purple power up sooner than intended, and can leave through the top route without having to go through more of this level. Likewise, if you need high jump to grab the super missiles here, or the green key, you can instead use wall jump or bomb jump to grab it early, and then escape through the bottom route. So what this type of map design does, is it allows players that are able to pick up on more advanced techniques to leverage their skill to their advantage, to either acquire power-ups sooner than intended, or to explore the game in any order they like. But what if there are no keys? What if you can go to any room in this map right at the start with no restrictions? This tends to feel overwhelming at first because it's easy to get lost, and you can run into more difficult encounters sooner than you're intended to, and you have a little sense of progression here because you don't really know if you're heading down the right direction. That's not really accessible, and all of modern gaming these days, accessibility is the guiding design principle. So if you make a game like this that's inaccessible, it doesn't fly. But the benefit is that you're not restricted. So you can choose to play the game with an unprecedented level of freedom. This is true freedom of choice, and this is what you would see in the Saga series. And sure enough, guess which series is still relatively niche compared to its peers after how long has Saga been going on for? Over 30 years? And it's still not a widely known mainstream game like its contemporaries like Final Fantasy, like Dragon Quest, like Persona. Even Shin Megami Tensei, which is considered to be a little bit more difficult than your average JRPG, is still not as challenging as the Saga series, because the Saga series well and truly does not hold your hand, and it doesn't really care if you can beat it without guidance or not, because to give you guidance is to change the structure of the game design. They would need to make the progression more linear, and then it wouldn't be Saga anymore. Another game that kind of has this type of no restriction approach is La Mulana, which is another game that is very difficult to get into, and a lot of players are going to be unable to complete without a guide because it doesn't hold your hand. And it doesn't want to hold your hand. This is meant to be an exploration game. You're not supposed to know if you're going on the right track, if you missed a puzzle, if you should or shouldn't be in this room. It wants to give you a different sort of experience than you would get from its contemporary counterparts. Not every game needs to have a similar structure to one another. There's room for games to use this more difficult approach of having no restrictions. There are games that like to have the Metroid style with some sequence breaking, and there are games that like to employ the linearity. And you're going to have your preferences. But just understand that there's room to have different styles of structure, even within the same genre. Not every exploration platformer is made equal. I may really love Symphony of the Night, but at the same time not care that much for Hollow Knight. And it just comes down to how each game decides to handle exploration. Now, if we switch over to this hub style, this is something that's more common in popular games. These games tend to force linear progression through a strict key and door layout, kind of like the one key fits one door approach, and this is seen in something like Metroid Prime 2. Each time you complete a little area, you need to return to the hub and get a proper key item to progress through a colored door to enter the next area. So the hub kind of functions as a glorified stage select. In fact, in Demon Souls, it pretty much is a stage select because it doesn't even give you these little transitory areas to give you the illusion of having everything be interconnected. You just pick a stage through a menu and you warp there. It keeps it simple, unlike its successor Dark Souls. In Dark Souls, you still have got the hub, but the gates are not made evident right away. It appears that you can take any route, but you'll eventually hit a dead end. So that's somewhat like the illusion of choice. You think you can go down a certain route, but it's not intended, at least not right now. But this is also subverted in the second half of Dark Souls, because then you can tackle the zones in any order. So Dark Souls is a rare example where it presents two different styles of progression in the same game. The first half is a little bit more linear, and the second half is much more open-ended. And this might be why you have a preference for either the first half of Dark Souls or the back half. And naturally, as we keep evolving through larger and larger scale maps, we eventually have to stumble into the open world. So unlike my other examples, I actually modeled this after a specific game, so try to see if you can guess which game it is just by looking at these different dots. S is of course the starting point, purple represent main story missions, and green are little optional objectives that you can stumble into as you explore. But I want you to keep in mind, look at the distribution of the main story quest, look how little of the overall map they occupy. This kind of structure doesn't take advantage of the map being this large and this open. And this is sadly representative of what you would find in a lot of modern open world games. They want to give you a lot of room, but they also want to tell you a linear story. But those two things are incongruent. You cannot tell a linear story by giving me a bunch of open space without telling the player to follow straightforward paths as they connect between the dots literally to reach each objective. This is the world map of Fallout 3. Because the main story is this linear, it doesn't take you to explore roughly half of this map. It doesn't even take you to 2 of the 4 corners. As a result, if you really want this to be a meaningful experience in terms of exploration, you get more out of it by exploring at your own pace and taking optional quests, just wandering around the wasteland at your own pace, and ignoring the main scenario. This game would make better use of its space for the main scenario if you could tackle the quests in any order. Instead, the best you can do is slightly sequence break the game through a knowledge check. If you know where your dad is hiding, you can skip roughly the first third of the game as you try to seek him out. But that's about it. The rest of the game still proceeds down a linear fashion. Look at these connected lines. You have to follow in this specific order. And because game developers, they tend to understand that certain players are going to want to ignore all of the optional content and just beeline through the main scenario, they're going to take a look at this map and go, that's kind of a lot of walking in a straight line between points. How can we make this faster and easier? And that's when things like cars and horses and different transportation methods are introduced to cut back on all of this wasteful walking between objectives. The thing is, the one positive benefit of Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas' maps is that they're so dense that you don't even care that you don't have a sprint button or a horse or a car or any method of transportation to make travel easier. But some developers, they make their maps so large, they can't possibly hope to put points of interest around every corner. They can't keep you entertained during that entire trek between objectives, and so they have to give you a horse. Otherwise you'll realize that there's so much wasted space in these worlds. In fact, just get off the horse and you can see firsthand. This is why I was not a fan of Rise of the Ronin or Elden Ring, because so much of the experience is simply spent moving around rather than engaging in exploration, combat, any of these types of things that make games fun. If you're gonna have me move around, at least make the act of moving around enjoyable. Forspoken tried to address this with its parkour, freestyle, magic traversal system, and while that does make movement more interesting, that game comes with its own fair share of issues that go beyond the scope of this video. Instead, I want to show you one more open world style map. This one is in a different approach to Fallout's. See if you can guess the game. Purple are the main scenario quests, and green are the secondary quests, not side quests, but the ones that run in tandem to the main scenario. This is the world of Hyrule in Tears of the Kingdom. This layout better suits the map because there's no restrictions in how you tackle the quest objectives. In fact, you can end the game early if you wanted to. You can even access the Thunderhead Isles early, which you would otherwise need to complete 4 dungeons to get to, through a knowledge check. So if you've already played through the game once, you can choose to go through it through a different order. Similar to the knowledge check in Fallout 3's main scenario, but instead of needing to follow the main scenario in a linear fashion afterward, you can still tackle the quest in as many different configurations as you please. Do 4 dungeons, 3, 2, 1, or just end the game if you want. These objectives are not only spread better throughout the map and make better use of its space, it also takes advantage of it being a large map because you can go through it in any direction that you want to. You're not forced to take a specific order. So in spite of all the sensationalist videos that you see of people turning their back on the Zelda series because they didn't like Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, I appreciate that these games took the open world formula and actually implemented it in a more meaningful way than almost any other open world designer. The clear downside to this approach to open world design is that the story has to be fragmented since the developers can't predict player progression. But I'd argue that open world games should be light on story for this very reason. It's the trade-off for having a giant map. If you want to tell a linear story, make a smaller scope game. Now some open world games, they give you quests in chunks, so they don't enforce rigid linearity. They instead give you a group of quests that you complete before unlocking the next group. You see this in the Grand Theft Auto series, in The Witcher, and in more recently, Cyberpunk. These quests are still strung together in a linear fashion, so it has a stronger story focus, but they don't allow true unrestricted freedom that these open world maps should be able to offer. Open world is a very malleable formula. Xenoblade X is technically unrestricted, but it's presenting you the map in layers, and the story progression allows you to access more vertical chunks of that world. There's nothing really stopping you from exploring this entire world on foot right when you start the game. And yeah, you won't be able to explore some of the more higher up locations, but you don't really have an incentive to explore because the points of interest are usually occupied by quests, and you don't unlock those unless you proceed down a certain portion of the main story. Very few open world games truly make use of this space in an unrestricted fashion, and I think Zelda is probably the closest that we're going to see from a mainstream big budget game. And unfortunately, I haven't drawn any more maps past this point, so that's all I've got for map design. Every video game, they toy with the idea of progression in different fashions, and depending on your tolerance, you may want extreme guidance, or you may want a completely hands-off experience. I'd argue that decades of linearity and essentially holding your hand type of guidance has conditioned players into believing that progression item collection equals more depth. But if you chart your favorite game from start to finish in the map form, take a look at how linear it is. Linearity is not bad. Progression is not bad, but these elements are not conducive to replayable experience, and I think this is why modern games lack so much of that replay value that arcade games and older experiences offered, and why modern players, they don't tend to replay modern games as frequently. And I'm not going to blame the players here. These games, they just really aren't designed to be that enjoyable on a repeat run. And we churn through games so fast these days, the lifespan of a game is fleeting. Very few titles are savored anymore, and I think the map structure of these games has something to do with it.